capture cost public institutions and careers of senior public officials. Business leaders play an influential role in the affairs of organizations and national economies, and it is one of the main reasons countries grow or fail. Their abilities and knowledge, ethical conduct, and commitment to their home countries add immense value to the provision of services, products, and even innovation to those countries. And some countries celebrate them, others despise them. In the US, some are legends such as Steve Jobs and Richard Branson. In the UK, Jack Ma of China. They are all recognized worldwide. In South Africa, we have a few, but we are ambivalent towards them. The widely traveled Euvin Naidoo has been recognized by Forbes as one of the top 10 leaders of the future. He was a fellow at Harvard Business School, worked for financial institutions, management consulting firms, and currently spends most of his time in Silicon Valley in the United States, where he holds the role of operating partner and MD at Venture University and the VU Fund, as well as serving on the board of the Center of Excellence in Financial Services. You too, please join us in our conversation using the hashtag the Modise Network, and that is for Twitter and other social media platforms. Euvin, pleasure to catch up with you.
Great pleasure to be here, Tim.
And it's been a long time, but I still have to take you back to your roots, you see, take you back squarely. KZN, that's where it all started, right?
Very proud to be from Kwadeguza, Stanger, and grew up there. And just came across a fantastic book, actually, that was written in Boston, and quite interesting on this theme of others writing about our leaders. A great book written on Chief Albert Luthuli, talking about the leaders of that generation in Groutville, in Stanger, in many of these small towns we don't talk about enough, and their leadership vision that still plays a role.
Right, but, you know, from Stanger and to the U.S. and across the world. Now, just briefly tell me your journey from Stanger to the bigger Boston area and the globe as your stage.
So very much grounded and proud to be South African. But the story is a simple one. I've been really the beneficiary of some great mentors and leaders that I had learned from. And so early on in business, got into management consulting together with a group of young South Africans. And amongst those leaders, their expectations was for us to be remained grounded in South Africa and our conditions in Africa, but to also educate ourselves internationally. And so a big break for me was to get a position to complete my master's in business administration in the United States. And I often thought, will it be relevant to our South African conditions? And I was very glad I took that step, because there I met a number of fellow Africans, Chinese, Indonesians, Australians, Americans, of course, and it's those ideas that have helped shape my career, which is international but also very much local based.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the multicultural setting that we're exposed to, and on in a global context. I spoke to the Vice Chancellor of the University of Joburg, who also studied in the US at some point in his life, and he was talking about sharing a room. A roommate that he had was from Japan, and that in a way also influenced his outlook. One of the foremost people when it comes to the Fourth Industrial Revolution discussions, at least, that are taking place in the country. Now, in my opening remarks, I spoke about leadership, that it plays a critical role, and I know that it is one subject that you're very passionate about. What do you think about the nations and cultures that celebrate their leaders? And in South Africa, I think we're not so sure what to make of business leaders specifically.
I think we're quite fortunate to be in a country, on a continent, in which we've had a remarkable set of leaders that have made a name for themselves globally. In fact, South Africa is quite unique because it's a melting pot that played a role in shaping Mahatma Gandhi, who spent time here, Winston Churchill, who of course was famously captured in Mozambique. It also shaped his era. And of course we have the likes of Chief Albert Luthuli and Nelson Mandela. We tend to, though, in South Africa, really look at leaders in terms of their impact that they've had on society. And one of the differences is, how do we approach our leaders in business? How do we approach our leaders in the social sector? And I think it's quite important that our context is, regardless of whether you're in business or in government, that impact on society is really where the basis of South Africa comes through. And so that's why I think South African businesses in particular have a mandate that needs to be more closely linked to the impact on the upliftment of those completely around it. It's quite a unique culture. And those companies that are seen to not have that stakeholder view feel the pain here in particular from the public.
Let me tell you something. I mean, we've been going through problems. We still have them, and we're trying to solve them. You're familiar. You're one of the role players.
Sure.
But I want you to share thoughts with me on what you think defines good leadership or can empower you to become a better leader, because many people are in leadership positions, different settings, whether at municipal level, in private business, in politics, in NGOs, and so on. But to you, from your experience, what defines a good leader?
So one of the great, lessons or themes I came across, particularly from spending time with students and people who have dedicated themselves to the subject of leadership, is one of the myths that we have to dispel is that leaders are born. In fact, the whole premise of South Africa, that if you're born a certain way, you have the right to be able to control or lead, is the foundation of how we emerged in our society to where we are today in a democratic country. And that myth is that leaders are not born, leaders are created. They're a creation of mentors, of circumstances, of support networks. And so I think the big element is that everyone can be a leader. Whether you're from Stanger, whether you're from Limpopo, whether you're from Cape Town or from the Sandton cities, the Santons of the world. And that's an important realization to convey to our young leaders as well as to those across the sectors, that leadership is something that is dependent on circumstance. And there are different types of leaders. There are leaders that we often confuse to be bold, but sometimes there is what we call the quiet leader, leaders who lead from behind, the servant leader. And I think that there is a role for leaders in the modern world to adapt to the right circumstances. So if we look as an example of a leader who studied, like a Nelson Mandela whom we venerate, you can see the stages of leadership, the active young Nelson Mandela driving change, and later on the statesman Nelson Mandela bringing people together and being a statesman to the world. And I think it's very important for us to draw on those role models, but also send the message to the young and to the youth that regardless of where you are, you can step into a leadership position. And it starts very simple. It can start in your school, it can start in your university. Take a stand against drugs. Take a stand against discrimination against women. Take a stand against fighting for furthering of education. And I think it's very important to have those leadership journeys and for role models to emphasize that leadership are small steps. One other point is that as parents, what I really enjoyed some of the discourse on is that leadership starts from a parenting perspective. Reading to your child for just a few minutes a day is found to accelerate development. And of course, you have to have the time and the circumstances, and there's an ecosystem. But there is a series of things that we as society can do in our everyday lives to help South Africa grow and maintain its leadership position on the continent itself.
Well, and that's exactly the point I want us to focus on. And you've worked in the South African environment. You understand the dynamics of our economy. Right. It's not growing at the rate it should. It actually has slowed down substantially.
Let's be frank about that.
Yeah.
We need growth 5 to 7% to be able to create the jobs and sustain the dream that our Constitution presented as an opportunity to all of us, the access to education and health, that 7% growth. It's a remarkable target to reach for any country in the world.
Yes.
And so certainly you can see our leadership addressing that challenge and seeing to it. But the 0.5% and the less than 0.5% poses a significant challenge.
It does. And given that we're already sitting with that problem of a huge unemployment, right? And the 7% or 5 to 7 that you're talking about, other nations are already achieving around the world. So it's as if in our case, we don't want to move to that level. And I'm saying it intentionally because the National Development Plan already says that. And we should have started experiencing it or seeing it the past few years. We haven't seen anything of that.
And here's the challenge.
Yeah.
As an emerging market, the way the global holders, the investors, and every country needs to partner with the rest of the world. No economy can survive on its own, regardless of the economy, whether you're the United States, China, or South Africa, which is a significant economy on the African continent. We need the partnership with other countries, other nations, multinationals, as well as our domestic industry. As an emerging market, the expectation is for us to have a higher growth rate than the developed world. That rewards the so-called risk that's taken in terms of those partnerships. So we certainly have to think through in terms of what are those levers of growth. Because as those levers grow, it means that better life for all, the jobs, the opportunity, that stability.
Now, let's think out loud,
right,
for the benefit of our nation.
Right.
And the many people who probably will take the advice from you. What is it that we can't do now that we're not doing? You know, if we had practical things that we did as South Africa, even if they don't materialize in the next couple of weeks, but we will see the results of over a 12 to 18-month period. What are the constraints, if you will, sure, that need to be dealt with, and the innovations that need to be introduced to move us forward?
Sure. Look, the first is you have to acknowledge the tremendous work that is taking place. And I think it's very easy for people around the world and for South Africans, for all of us to have our opinion on what should be done. So let's acknowledge what needs to be done. I think the first is to acknowledge the challenge, number one.
Yeah.
This is important. I think that has come home to roost. I think the second, and building on the work that has been done, is that the partnership between business and government is critical. This isn't a problem that either sector faces. It's a problem that all of us face communally. And I think a number of those initiatives are great. But if I can go back to some of my work that was very important to me, you know, as a partner driving a consulting company across Africa, is to go back to what we call the customer journey. And if we trace the customer journey, that means is, how can you better serve the people that you are aiming to support? And recently we had a World Economic Forum meeting in San Francisco that brought leaders across. And we changed that dialogue from customer centricity to what we call citizen centricity. And this is a very important concept. We often talk about the Ubers of the world, and that we're able to see that journey of how we walk through that journey of what an Uber is like from the time we hail it. Yet for citizens and citizen centricity, across the world, getting an identity document is a difficult task. I was in Germany several weeks ago and I was joking with my German colleagues. It was actually a conference on investment into Africa, and I said, how is it getting a passport in Europe? And they unanimously said it is also tough. It can take 3 to 6 months. The difference is that in many developed countries, that is an inconvenience. In emerging markets, it can be life and death to some, and it can mean whether your business fails or succeeds if you are spending days doing this. So this citizen centricity is something, and let me bring it back to your original question, is what can we do now? I think all of us, whether you're in business, whether you're in government, walk through the steps of those that are in the path. So what are the steps to better serve those, as an example of one journey, getting an identity document? What are the steps in terms of registering a business? What are those barriers? And I think a lot of work is absolutely being done on that. But let's drive that home. And if we solve some of these core, what we call pain points for citizens, for customers, how can those be accelerators to getting business and getting innovation done? As an example, how can we build and improve on the registration of a business, of simplifying processes so people can start that process of becoming entrepreneurs?
Now, notwithstanding the inequalities in the country, South Africans are actually proud of the fact that we are an important democracy on the continent. And one other thing was that we were once the biggest economy on the continent. When they learn that we've slipped from 1 to 2 to 3 now, and then there are other indicators like being less competitive and other things where we don't look good at all, it concerns them. Where did we lose the plot then? Because the expectation was that we may lose in football. Well, we can live with that, but let's remain number one as being the leading economy of the continent.
You know, it's an interesting question, and again, I'll share my personal views as I'm doing in this discussion. The idea of competition is an interesting one, because at the same time, these titles of who's first, second, or third, I think, you know, that's very interesting in terms of if that's how we want to measure ourselves. But at the end of the day, the United States went through a similar dilemma, and let me draw a comparison. Several years ago, post the financial crisis, the United States found itself in a dilemma where it felt, from a technology perspective, it was feeling that other countries are moving ahead. From an infrastructure perspective, it found that its highways and airports were not what was considered to be the most advanced. Its education system, as an example, may have had some great institutions, but for a number of Americans in less fortunate suburbs, this was a challenge in terms of their education system. Access to healthcare. If this sounds familiar, it's not a coincidence. Challenges with healthcare, challenges with education, challenges with infrastructure, a feeling that you are being left behind. And so in many ways, paradoxically, while we are located in South Africa, we are in many ways that dominant, strong, historic economy that played a similar role. And I found it quite interesting as to how particularly leaders rallied around this call in the United States to say, how do we change the narrative that the competition is not internal, that it is constructive engagement and competition with markets across. And I think for South Africa, it's very important for us to realize the support for our businesses locally and internationally is absolutely important, because the competition is not inside. As a country, as a nation, we have to empower our workforce, seek FDI. And so how do we change that narrative for South Africa Inc. to work together? Because, Tim, we do have a lot going for us. Our infrastructure still remains ahead. We still have one of the strongest banking sectors in emerging markets. It's a crown jewel, in fact, for many countries. Our governance system and court system still remain strong. And I think we have to rally around rejuvenating that energy to say, how can we make all of this work?
Euvin, you're widely traveled. We're going to look at how the world thinks and compare what is going on around the world to what is going on in South Africa, as well as talk about what we as individuals can do to move our lives forward. I'll be continuing the conversation with Euvin Naidoo after the break, and you take part in our conversation on Twitter, #the Modise Network.